Good afternoon. Welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series, part of Huxley College of the Environment, which is located in Bellingham, Washington, a subset of Western Washington University. As a reminder, we'll have questions, time for Q&A at the end of the talk, last 10 or 15 minutes, we hope. You're welcome to submit questions via the Zoom chat or the Zoom Q&A towards that. My name is Stefan Freeland. And today I am pleased to introduce our guest, Dr. Angela Strecker. Angela is the director of the Institute of Watershed Studies here at Huxley, as well as an associate professor of environmental sciences. Prior to joining us here at Western, Angela was at Portland State University, where she was faculty as well as director of the Center for Lakes and Reservoirs. She completed her Bachelor of Science at the University of Regina and a PhD in biology at Queen's University in Ontario. Please join me in welcoming Angela Strecker.
Hi, Stefan. Thanks so much. I'm going to get my screen share going here. Okay. How's that look? Everybody see that okay?
All good.
Great. Great. So I'm really pleased to be here, and I hope this is an enlightening, discussion that we can have. And before I get started, I really want to acknowledge Dr. Ariana Kealpala, who did her PhD in my lab and really did the bulk of this research. She is currently a postdoc at the University of Vermont, and she is a force of nature. So I was really proud of all the work that she did, and I'm happy to share some of that with you today. So before I get started, I like to kind of reflect a little bit on how I got to be where I am, because I think if you talk to people at different stages of their careers, they're going to tell you really different things about their pathway and how they ended up where they are. And so I wanted to share a little bit of that with you. And so as Stefan mentioned, I did my undergrad degree at the University of Regina, which was my hometown. And I started as a pre-med student and was doing actually pretty terribly in most of the pre-med classes and decided that that wasn't really for me. So I was doing relatively well in biology and I kind of liked the classes, so I kept on going with that. That was kind of pre-having, environmental science degrees as a possibility. And I thought at one point I'd be interested in doing research, and found that almost all research positions are looking for somebody who has experience already, and I didn't have any. And how do you get experience when you need experience to be competitive for positions? So I started talking to some professors. I was really lucky to be at a school that was pretty small, about the same size as Western, and I really got to know my professors because I had my upper division classes were small. I got to get, talk to them about what kind of research they were doing in their labs. And I kind of lucked into working with a new professor who was really interested in studying ponds and the organisms that live in ponds. And so I got to do this really cool experiment in the Canadian Rocky Mountains, looking at the effects of climate warming on pond communities. And these are representing the ponds there. And it was really hard work, and I was not very good at it. When I first started, I fell in a stream the very first day in the field, and I think they were pretty sure that I was going to not succeed, but I kept at it. And I really found that I had a passion for research, and I really loved doing it, and I really loved doing things that matter for the environment. So during this time when I was doing research, I also had some illustrious positions at Burger King and Montana's Cookhouse. So lest you think that it was just this kind of, always very, glorious pathway, there were some stops along the way. So from there, I talked to lots of people about doing graduate research, and I found a program in Kingston, Ontario, at Queen's University that was a good fit for me. I had studied an invasive species in lakes there, and I found that it's a lot easier to do fieldwork when you drive to your field sites as opposed to hiking many, many miles to get to them. So that was a great experience for me. After I finished my PhD, I did some postdoc positions, they're called postdoctoral. One at the University of Toronto, looking at Lake Huron fish communities. and one at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I looked at large river fish communities. And that really helped me land a faculty position at Portland State University, as Stefan was saying. And so that was the last recession, which was a terrible time to be looking for a job. And I was getting pretty ready to pack it in and just try something else, because I wasn't having a lot of success finding academic jobs. And luckily I had some good people in my corner that told me that I should not ever give up, and I didn't. And then I moved to Bellingham last summer. And I'm really, excited to be in this college and doing some really fun things. And so before I kind of move on, I want to talk about the importance of mentorship. And, without some of the people on the screen and lots of, dozens of other unnamed people, I would most certainly not be here today. I was a first generation college student and first person in my family to go to school. And I had no idea how to navigate university or grad school or any of it. And so I really, really learned a lot from talking to, peers, having a good support network, talking to graduate students to find out what is grad school. And some of you may be thinking about that right now. And it's really good to talk to people about what that experience is like. And then also talking to faculty and getting to know them and getting to know their experiences. Okay, so I kind of talked about my first research experience working in mountain lakes, and that's kind of an important jumping off point for what I want to talk about today, because, we would go out and sample some ponds, and there would be these amazingly beautiful, colorful, large invertebrates, things like fairy shrimp and, giant copepods and stuff like that. But then you'd go to a lake nearby and all those species would be absent. They wouldn't be there. And it's because of fish stocking, because fish have been stocked across the globe in places, particularly in mountain systems where they, never existed before. And so today I kind of want to talk, I'm going to give probably lots of background and not that much actual data, but I think it's kind of an interesting story to tell. And so, for the most part, when we think about stocking for fish, we're thinking about recreation. But it has a really long history that kind of predates this idea of fishing for recreation. The European settlers, when they moved to first North America, but also westward, didn't really like any of the fish that they found. They called them rough fish. And so there's, more than a century worth of stocking of species like brook trout, bass, catfishes, and lots of other species as well. One of the most predominantly stocked species is the rainbow trout, which ironically is native to where we live. And the brown is showing the native range of this species. But you see the pinks and the burgundies are showing all the places where it's been stocked, usually on purpose, across the US and in more than 100 countries around the globe. So I talked about this kind of long history of fish stocking, and initially it was usually done for the purposes of having food, having an easy source of protein that was accessible to many. And they would take these trains and they would load them up with water, of course, and fish fry, and then go across the country and dump them into water bodies. And rainbow trout are a really amazing species because they can survive a lot of really terrible conditions. And so this, was really nothing for them to be able to kind of survive this, and kind of built up a whole hatchery industry. But around the mid 20th century, people started to have more spare time, and the focus began to shift more towards recreation. And one of the big ways that state fish and wildlife agencies get their funding is through fishing licenses. So having, stock species for people to go out and fish for was important. And then also there's a tax on fishing equipment that comes back to state agencies to fund their fishery programs. So it kind of creates this feedback loop where there's public pressure to stock cultured fishes that really influences agency decisions to stock those. So a bit of a circle there. These are some data on the kind of magnitude of stocking and how it's changed over time in the US. And so this is data collected by Anders Halvorsen and going back to the 30s. And these are in weight in kilograms times 10 to the 6. So please don't go thinking these are small numbers. They are very large number. Hundreds of thousands of kilograms of fish are stocked. And so if we look at that trend, it's increased over time. And if we kind of pull out the dark gray bar, we see that rainbow trout is kind of one of the dominant species that's been stocked over time. I want to kind of highlight a couple additional pieces of reading that you might be interested in. Chasing Rainbows is an article that he wrote kind of based on his learning, the same person, Anders Halvorsen, about his learning about the ecological effects of rainbow trout. And then a book that he wrote called An Entirely Synthetic Fish that kind of documents this long history of hatchery fish and stocking with rainbow trout. So all told, in 2004, this added up to about 1.75 billion fish being stocked by state and federal agencies in the US. It's a very big number. But it's complicated. It's complicated. And I'm going to say more about that. But so this is a great paper from about 10 years ago that talked about why we were ignoring the potential effects of non-native species or non-indigenous species on endangered salmon. And they looked at this through the lens of first, let's capture just kind of what are the basic trends. And we see that looking across Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, we see that there are up to, several dozen non-native fish in different places. And that's a large number. That's a pretty large number. Most of those are in intentional introductions, although certainly some what we call bucket biologists, people dumping fish in that don't belong in places because they want to fish for them. That happens. So what this demonstrates is this big landscape where endangered salmon are interacting with non-native species. And this graph that I'm going to show on the bottom here shows several kind of commonly stocked species, including catfish, crappie, largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, walleye, and yellow perch. And on the y-axis is the percentage of salmon in their diet. And we see that for some species, this is really low. So they're probably, the crappie probably aren't consuming a lot of salmon, but some species like smallmouth bass and catfish, this is really high, and walleye as well, actually. We see that potentially they're consuming a large number of salmon. And again, just to highlight, these are species that are being stocked purposely for recreation, for people to fish for, but they're consuming a species that is, threatened and endangered. If we look specifically at the Columbia River and looking at both, adults kind of coming back from the ocean, I just saw actually some salmon today down in Arroyo Park, and that was pretty cool. So coming back from the ocean, they're going through this gauntlet of, dozens of non-native fish species that they're encountering that could be, competing with them. And juveniles, when they're out migrating, are of course going through that same gauntlet where they're experiencing potentially competition and predation from non-native species. And that gets more intense the closer they get down to the mouth of the Columbia. A further kind of complication, and this is a great paper because it really kind of takes aim at a lot of the bizarre practices that are happening in our region. This pie chart shows funding in millions of dollars that goes to research and control of fish in the Columbia Basin by Bonneville Power Administration. And as part of their dam mitigation, so essentially the money that they pay to kind of offset the environmental effects of dams. And I'm going to focus in on kind of like the small pieces of the pie. So a couple of things to look at here. So one, here they're talking about control, and that is essentially control of native predators, so things that consume salmon. So species like pike minnow, which is native to this region, as well as things like avian predators. But there's also a fairly big chunk that's what we call enhancement. So that's stocking of non-native fish. So, it kind of boggles the mind a little bit to see these kind of conflicting priorities laid out this way. And to just kind of drive this home in terms of, what this means for just dollars. This is just one person who is fishing for, they're calling it squawfish, but pike minnow is the real name. And so there's a bounty paid on these fish. And he, in the first 5 months of the season, and this is several years old, over $50,000 of just fishing for this native species that arguably doesn't necessarily eat a lot of salmon because they've co-evolved together and salmon know how to avoid them. So a little bit of kind of backwardsness there. Okay, so this creates a bit of a conundrum, right? So Fish and Wildlife agencies get most of their funding from licenses and tags. So they feel beholden to stock fish that people want to fish for, right? So it's kind of the recreationists driving the boat here. But introduced species, especially game fish, have really significant ecological impacts. And so I'm going to kind of switch gears and talk about those consequences for a few minutes here. And I'm going to focus in on mountain lakes because for the most part, there were never fish in these lakes, and so their consequences of fish stocking have been very significant there. And so in a typical mountain lake, the top predators would have been things like amphibians, large invertebrates, potentially in the open water, the pelagic zone, or in the benthic zone, so along the bottom of the lakes. And then there would have been some smaller invertebrates, and then phytoplankton and periphyton, which is just algae that grows on rocks and surfaces. So when fish stocking happens, there's a kind of a cascade of effects. So amphibians are negatively affected. Large benthic invertebrates, so things like mayflies, dragonflies, those are all negatively affected, as are large zooplankton. There's not a lot of food in these lakes for a species like trout and so they end up growing very slowly, and they will consume pretty much anything that they can find. That releases some of the smaller species potentially, but also adds nutrients into the system, because the trout essentially are just this big pulse of nutrients into the system. And then potentially we can see increases in algal growth because of that stocking. So lots of changes. And these changes go outside of the boundaries of the lake itself. And so I mentioned mayflies as an example of a kind of a large macroinvertebrate. And in a typical fishless lake, they live in the water when they're larval, and then as adults they emerge. And some people may have seen this before. They often emerge in a short period of time, this big emergence of little winged insects that drive everybody crazy. But this is a really important food source for birds and a host of other organisms. But in the lakes that contain fish, the trout eat these larval stages before they even get a chance to emerge. So the study was looking at whether there are effects of this fish stocking in terrestrial ecosystems. And so in several years, they collected several years of data with the abundance of birds on the y-axis. And then they compared kind of before the emergence of mayflies and after, with the white boxes representing fishless lakes and the hatch bars are fish lakes. So we see no differences before and after emergence. I think you know where this is going, but during the big mayfly pulse, we see that there's much higher abundance of birds at fishless lakes than there are in fish stock lakes, because essentially there's just not that much emerging from the fish stock lakes. So this kind of demonstrates that this fish stocking is not only having effects within lakes, but also outside of lakes, right? So it's having effects that kind of cross boundaries. Another kind of unintended consequence of fish stocking is bioaccumulation of toxic contaminants. And I'm going to illustrate this with PCBs, a pretty kind of famous example, where at low concentrations, they kind of build up in the food web through this feeding. Essentially, the organisms are feeding on each other as they go up the food web. But because a lot of these contaminants are lipophilic, meaning fat-loving, they kind of adhere to the fat and are selectively retained as you go higher and higher. So if you start with, let's say 1 molecule in water, if you go up to, smelt, you're at already 835,000 times greater concentration of PCBs compared to where you started. If You go up to lake trout, the top predator in the lake, 2.8 million times more. And in herring gulls, we see this is 25 million times more PCBs compared to that. So this is a process that's biologically oriented. They're feeding and in the accumulation of a toxic contaminant at a much higher rate than we would predict, just based on, kind of regular feeding patterns. And so for mercury, which I'm going to focus on in this talk, what happens is that it becomes methylated by this CH3 molecule by a number of different processes. I'm not going to kind of get into the weeds with that. But when it becomes methylated is when it becomes toxic and when it becomes lipophilic. And when it becomes toxic, it can have severe consequences for human health. So Minamata disease is an example of severe mercury poisoning. So the same kind of process occurs as with the PCBs. So it starts with a relatively small amount of mercury in the bottom of the food web. And then increasingly, as you go up the food web, we get these really high concentrations of mercury, methylated mercury in fish. And in mountain lake food webs, this is particularly concerning because we know that even though we think these systems are pristine, that contaminants are traveling long distances through the atmosphere and are being selectively deposited at high elevations. So this is a real concern in terms of having people out there consuming potentially contaminated fish. Okay, so why are there fish in these lakes in the first place? Well, it certainly wasn't for necessarily the same reasons as in, I talked about for food, but rather in mountain lakes, it was often to be a way to draw people into the mountains as visitors and to find public support for these wilderness preserves. And, they've done a really effective, good job of this. So about 95% of large mountain lakes have been stocked across the US. And that's just a kind of a staggering number. It's really become ingrained in, culture, in our culture to go fishing on public lands. But this is really, kind of conflicting because a lot of, public lands are wilderness, and wilderness areas are supposed to be kind of protected in this, primeval character without improvements to maintain, natural conditions. And arguably fish stocking is kind of the opposite of that. But state jurisdiction kind of, takes over with respect to fish and wildlife management, often in these wilderness areas. And so what we see is that fish stocking is fairly common for the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, but comes into direct conflict with National Park Service policies. And so, kind of as a way to illustrate, how do the parks deal with this? Where does the rubber hit the road? I want to talk about the environmental assessment that Mount Rainier developed that had three kind of options for fish management. So the first was that, keep going, stay the course, which was to say not really any management of stocked fish. Alternative 2 was to remove fish from some lakes, but keep some lakes for recreation. And alternative 3 was to remove all non-natives and then to reintroduce native fishes. So maybe this, on the surface, this seems like an environmental issue. It's a science issue potentially, right? But it actually turns out it's kind of a people issue as well, because what other national parks had found, including several parks in the Sierra Nevada, is that their efforts to remove fish from all lakes and streams were not always successful, and they had some vandalization of some of their gill nets that were in place to remove the stocked fish, because it was people's livelihood that was being affected, right? So tourists would come to the Sierra Nevada to go fishing in these beautiful, pristine mountain lakes, and to take all the fish out of them and not talk to people about it was, created kind of a human environmental conflict. So that's kind of where our research jumps in, is trying to understand this management predicament a little bit better. And so to really get a sense of what people think, what visitors to the parks actually think. And so we kind of, tried to look at whether ecological and cultural values could be balanced. What is the social perception of fish stocking? Do public values of wilderness outweigh the value of fishing, and might visitors be at risk of consuming contaminated fish? So I'm going to kind of highlight some of the key results from this, but if you're interested at this at all, I'm going to point you towards this article that has a kind of more detail about our methodology and our results. Okay, so we worked, well, when I say we, I mostly mean my student Ariana. It's the royal we. So she surveyed visitors at North Cascades and Mount Rainier at a number of different sites to try to get a broad cross-section of visitors. She got about 400 responses, which is a 60% response rate, which is actually very high for these types of surveys. So we were pretty happy about that. The survey respondents used checkbox and Likert questions to determine their recreational and angling habits, ecological knowledge, and were they even aware of fish stocking as a practice, what they valued from lakes and public lands, and what their perceptions of stocking and fisheries management were when they learned more about some of the practices that were occurring. So I'm not going to get in deep on the statistics because they're a little complicated, but this kind of diagram should sum it up. So essentially we took these input variables, so knowledge, demographics, habits, values, and knowledge about kind of ecosystem health and climate change. And we're interested in whether or not they were good predictors of attitudes towards fisheries management. And so to do that, we had to kind of ask certain types of questions to learn about what people's attitudes were. So we had kind of multiple questions that we asked that gave us a kind of a broad sense of what the attitudes were. And so here's some examples that these types of questions are kind of similar. There's a little bit of difference between them. Removing fish, action should be taken to alleviate the effects of fish stocking is legitimate. And so this gives us a sense of overall attitude towards fisheries management. Okay, so if in case there are social scientists out there, they're always really interested in the demographics. And so, of course, because this is a national park, some of these are definitely skewed from the regular population. But for middle-aged people, for the most part, a slight skew towards males, higher income, unsurprisingly, predominance of white and Caucasian respondents. And fairly well educated, so 42% with a bachelor's degree or higher. In terms of their recreational habits, about a third were members of some sort of organized group, whether it was kind of more environmental, like the Sierra Club, recreational, highlikers, or resource-oriented, like Trout Unlimited. About a third had fished on public lands before, but only about 3% were actually fishing at the time of the survey. A lot of people, a fair number of people expressed interest in learning how to fish. And so it kind of suggests that there's, some, demand for people, they want to learn and get out there. And about, 50% of anglers on public lands specifically choose mountain lakes. So this gives us some good insight in terms of, what we might be thinking about if we're thinking about risk of consuming contaminated fish. In terms of knowledge and values, I'm not going to go super deep into these results. I just want to kind of touch on a couple of things. I think these results are interesting kind of in and of themselves. But, when people think about lakes in national parks, especially, well, of course, the ones we were visiting, but, they value them for cultural significance, their intrinsic value, just the fact that they exist. Skip over fishing to go to biodiversity is really high, clean water and recreation. Fishing was the lowest, and we see that the dark green color there is the strongly agree. And we see that it's actually the lowest of all of those in terms of what people value. So that's an interesting trend. When we look at perceived threats to park ecosystems, we see that, for the most part, most of these different types of stressors are rated as major threats. That's the dark orange, with climate change being the highest. So there seems like there's a decent awareness of climate change as an issue. terms of ecological knowledge, for the most part, people rate themselves kind of as average, which is this kind of teal color in the middle. There's not really big differences between knowledge of different types, about different types or types of ecosystems or different aspects of these systems. Okay, so what we found was that about less than half of people valued mountain lakes for fishing. So that was kind of an interesting result in and of itself. Half of respondents were aware that fish stocking had happened historically, which means that half were not. So lots of people didn't know that that had happened. And about half thought that stocking was bad for lake ecology. So this is before we had given them any additional information. So then we had them read the statement. So the statement gives just a brief history about fish stocking, what some of the ecological effects are, and what the park was doing about it. And so we kept it short purposely to kind of, you don't want to, lose people. You kind of want to keep them engaged. So then we asked, more questions after they read that. And essentially 80% of respondents thought that the concerns about fish stocking were legitimate, which was about a 30% increase from a similar question that was posed before they had read that excerpt. So it suggests that people have some malleability in terms of how they think about these issues. And only about 10% thought it was overblown. More than half thought that action should be taken in terms of fish removal. And so then that was, again, a really kind of interesting result that we found. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this earlier that we had to, in order to figure out what people's attitudes were, we had to ask them a lot of questions. And we asked them a lot of questions that kind of went along with this. How much do you agree or disagree with a bunch of statements? And then we were able to classify people into 4 camps, or 4 clusters, if you will. So a pro-stocking factor, a neutral group, we call it pro-preservation. So this is essentially, fish should be removed from all of these places where they were introduced. And then the 4th was what we called pro-conservation, which is kind of a more balanced approach that conserves some spaces for recreation, like fishing, but also conserves some spaces for ecological protection. And so people, would score differently on these statements that kind of would cluster them into these, camps. So for example, someone who answered that the benefits of stocking outweigh the ecological consequences, we would put into the kind of the pro-stocking. So they would score highly on this. And so again, with multiple questions, we can kind of put people into clusters. And so, for example, we see that pro-stocking fish add value to mountain lakes despite concerns. For example, I'm just highlighting the bold here to kind of illustrate this, but pro-preservation, they scored kind of really high on this. Action should be taken to alleviate the effects of fish on all lakes. Again, so, preserve everything. And then the last one is the pro-conservation, which some lakes should be designated for fishing, others for pristine nature. So we were able to kind of group people into these 4 categories. We kind of threw out the neutral because it doesn't really tell us all that much. And then we looked at those predictors to see what was predicting these attitudes. And so I'm going to kind of talk about each one of these one by one. So the pro-stocking group typically had less education. They were not concerned about climate change. They viewed national park systems as healthy. And initially they viewed stocking favorably, but didn't change their mind after the fact. So those are all the kind of factors that seem to really influence this attitude in respondents. In the middle is the kind of pro-conservation, and these were folks that were maybe less concerned about climate change. They didn't have prior knowledge about stocking. They tended to be anglers, which I think is really interesting because you would actually think that the anglers would fall over here, but not. And initially viewed stocking favorably, but their minds changed somewhat. And then the pro-preservation group was most influenced by they tended to be people that were knowledgeable about ecology. We saw this pro-preservation attitude more often at Mount Rainier than North Cascades. They were concerned for ecosystem health. They thought that lakes were important for recreation, but not for fishing. Initially, they perceived stocking to be negative and that feeling was maintained, and they tended not to be members of other types of natural resource types of groups. So there's a lot to kind of unpack here, and I don't really have time to get into all of it. But what we thought was really quite interesting was that nearly half of respondents could be clustered into this middle group. So this pro-conservation, that some lakes should be for fishing and some lakes should be for restoration, was kind of the predominant attitude that we found amongst people. And so I think that is kind of a really interesting finding, and I'm going to circle back to that at the end. Okay, so in terms of fish consumption, and thinking, about contaminants, we found that about 54% of anglers consumed fish on at least one occasion annually. So that's a kind of a decent chunk of people that are not consuming fish, but a number of people that are consuming fish. If we extrapolate that to the number of visitors that come to these parks, which for Mount Rainier is very high, that's potentially, like 150,000 people that are consuming fish. That's a relatively high number. What we're, most concerned about is kind of this group over here that are consuming on more than 10 occasions a year, because that might put them into kind of a more concern in terms of contaminant exposure. So the next kind of logical question is, well, how much mercury actually are in the fish? And so as another kind of chapter in her dissertation, Ariana went to 19 lakes that look stunningly beautiful. And so these were scattered across Olympic, North Cascades, and Mount Rainier National Parks. And she did this over a couple of years. And sampled for fish and a host of other kind of limnological variables, as well as using GIS and some other tools to kind of get information about the lakes that are not as well studied. And I should say, I went sampling with her once, and it almost killed me. It was like 70-pound backpack of sampling gear and camping gear, and you name it. We had like paddles and boats, and it was a lot. So she worked really hard, and really, I'm really proud of the work that she did on this. Okay, so how much mercury? So this is on a logarithmic scale. So just to kind of point that out to start with. And I'm going to go park by park, and then kind of breaking it down species by species. And so the different colors are representing different species. If you don't see a colored bar, that means that species was not found in our sampling. And so in Mount Rainier, essentially these letters are telling us that there was no difference between eastern brook trout in green and rainbow trout mercury concentrations. In North Cascades, however, we found that cutthroat trout had higher contaminants of mercury compared to rainbow trout. And then lastly, in Olympic, we found that, again, eastern brook trout had higher concentrations compared to rainbow trout. And these dashed lines are here for a reason. So the upper is indicating the consumption advisory or criteria value for the EPA. So essentially, it is just really not recommended that people consume ever fish that have more than 300 nanograms per gram of mercury. And we were pleased to see that none of the fish that we caught exceeded that. There was one that was kind of close, but for the most part, fish kind of fell under that consumption value. However, this lower dashed line is showing the EPA's recommendation for subsistence intake. And so if you were subsisting off of these fish, you would find that there's actually a lot of individual fish that have exceeded that in lots of lakes that have fish at high concentrations that have exceeded that subsistence limit. Luckily, we think that it's unlikely that people are fishing here for subsistence reasons. The other factor we wanted to look at is, what was actually influencing this mercury. And if you remember, this is on a log scale. So these are, orders of magnitude differences in fish concentrations. And so we know that we see differences across lakes. And this is largely explained by tree cover in the nearshore region, as well as fish feeding behavior. And so when fish are feeding kind of more benthically, that is to say along the bottom, then they tended to have higher higher mercury concentrations. So, okay, so to sum up, we found that visitor attitudes generally aligned with, what scientists and park managers kind of suggested, that fish should, in general should be removed. And this kind of reflects an overall, shift in our society towards non-consumptive recreation, just essentially going out and recreating just for the sake of enjoying it, and support for restoration-based management. We found that pro-stocking and pro-preservation attitudes were less prevalent compared to pro-conservation attitudes. Again, with the conservation being like kind of, it's good for everyone. So to have some lakes for recreational fishing and some just for ecological restoration. It kind of, I think it illustrates a nice concept that, sometimes the groups on the edges are the loudest and get the most attention, but for the most part, people are in the middle. And kind of want to be able to strike a balance. So lastly, mercury concentrations were variable, and this is influenced by things that are happening outside the lake, but also inside the lake. But it could help us prioritize which lakes fish should be removed from. So if we can kind of predict which lakes the fish are going to have a lot of mercury, we could say, well, those are really lakes where you should think about removing them. So I hope I've convinced you that, non-native fish stocking is, it's kind of a big issue, and we need a broader conversation about, what these consequences are, especially when we're stocking with non-native fish species. Angling is still very popular, and I would predict that this year would have been off the charts in terms of, people going out and fishing in these places. And this, so a balanced approach could be really important for long-term success, but also, we should be concerned about mercury exposure. And lastly, outreach could be a really important tool to get support for removal efforts, but also to inform the general public about, exposure to contaminants. And so we could use people's interest in angling to really kind of help with these fish removal efforts. Okay, I think I've talked long enough. Just kind of want to acknowledge the lots of field and lab help from many, many sources. I don't think I got them all here, but I want to also point out that Ariana was supported by National Science Foundation fellowships that she applied for and really was successful at getting funding for her research. So with that, I will happily take any questions.
Thank you. Wonderful. And yes, we have a few questions and time for more. So people submit those via Zoom chat or Q&A. A couple of questions about mercury, the correlation between tree cover and mercury, and then a broader question of the variability in general. Why is that more the lake or the fish or what's going on there?
Okay, so I'll start with tree cover. So tree cover, it turns out that leaves and needles, especially for conifers, are really good at kind of scavenging mercury from the atmosphere. So the more trees you have, essentially, those leaves and those needles are capturing it and they're holding on to it. And then, eventually when they fall off, which is less often for conifers, more often for deciduous, those get flushed into lakes because lakes are at the bottom of the watershed. And so, kind of eventually everything makes its way there. And then it kind of just acts as a sink and collects all that mercury. So we think that's kind of one of the driving factors. There's other, potential reasons as well that have to do with how mercury switches from its atmospheric Hg form to the methylated toxic form. So that's the first part of the question. The second part was why the variability, and this is essentially what we were trying to answer. And I think we got I think we got some of the way in finding an answer, but it's not just. It's not going to be just one answer, and it's not going to be the same everywhere. And so it has to do with the deposition from the atmosphere. So places that get more snow and more rain are going to have more atmospheric mercury. So if you think about, west side of the Cascades versus east side of the Cascades, that's going to have a big effect on deposition patterns. The presence of glaciers, that's probably also important in terms of their kind of storing all that mercury in them. What's happening in the watershed, how quickly is that being transported, those leaves and needles being transported down, but also things that are happening inside the lake. So the feeding, we think the benthic invertebrates are really getting mercury potentially by their feeding mode. The fish are eating a lot of those because they're higher value foods potentially, and they're just getting a lot of mercury. And so it's not a clean story, but nothing in environmental science rarely is a clean story. So those are some of the factors. There are lots of others. So the presence of wetlands, that's kind of a big factor. Yeah, I'm going to kind of run out of things to say, but yeah, there's lots of kind of complex factors.
And the follow-up to that was, is the mercury an issue beyond human fish consumption? Are there efforts at removing mercury, either instead of or in addition to removing fish?
I'm not aware that mercury can be removed. It's very persistent, lasts for a long time. I don't know. It's still being used in parts of the globe, right? So even though we've kind of turned off the taps on mercury, there's places where it's still coming from different countries and within the U.S. even, right, from coal-fired power plants, and so it can come from long distances away. And it's not just mountain environments, but Arctic environments. We see the same patterns, that we get this long-range transport, and once it's there, it's really hard to get rid of. Right.
Let's see, a quick question. Is there a difference between the terms anglers, angling, fishing, people, fishing? Are you distinguishing subcategories of fish capturers?
No.
Okay.
No, we try to keep it pretty simple. So, with surveys of people, you want to set the bar, really the entry bar really low. You want to make it easy for people to talk to you. And so we tried to just be as general as we could be. And one of the kind of consequences, not consequences, but like you kind of think back about the people that you missed. And we know that there's people whose attitudes we potentially missed. That's always a concern. And one of the groups we know we missed were people with small children. Because they're not going to be able to take the time to kind of wrangle their kids and fill out a survey at the same time. And so you kind of hope you do the best job at getting a broad representation of people. But short answer, no, we did not subdivide our anglers.
But and all of the fishing is recreational. There's not any commercial fishing up in these lakes. Is that true?
Not that I'm aware of. Let me think about that for a second. I'm thinking of there's a large lake in Olympic National Park, but I don't know that even that would have. I'm not aware of any commercial fishing that goes on in these systems.
So a question about in lakes where fish have been removed, then what happens?
Good question. That's a great question. So generally, okay, I'm going to ignore the mercury part of that because I don't know that we really know. But in terms of the ecology, that we typically see recovery of amphibians seem to recover pretty well. And they've seen that in California, that fish removal has been successful. The invertebrates generally recover pretty well, although some of them don't. Some of them were just knocked down to really low numbers could take decades to recover. But yeah, so that is kind of an ongoing area of study, is that how long does it take for these systems to recover, or do they even recover after fish have been removed?
Right. So you mentioned that there's a sort of a state-federal clash in terms of management. So are there ways of protecting fish? Specifically, does the wild and scenic river designation have an impact on state management in terms of stocking of fish?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I don't think so, but I don't know. I will admit I am not a environmental policy expert at all. And certainly, rivers kind of present their own problems because it really makes it really easy for organisms to move around. And One example that I'm thinking about is the John Day River in Oregon, which is portions of it are one of the longest, I think if not the longest, wild and scenic river in the US. And they have listed salmon runs and steelhead. I don't know if they're all listed. I'll have to check my facts, but anyways, there's smallmouth bass in that river and they're spreading. So they're moving kind of gradually up river, and they're kind of having greater and greater overlap. And it's not because they're being stocked. It's not because of any regulations. It's just because they're in the system and they can spread, readily. And so, I think we have a lot of kind of hard questions to ask about, where we stock. Do we stock in systems where it's possible for organisms to move out of really easily and spread? Yeah, and I was kind of listening to stories about the giant Asian hornet, and if people, people are way up in arms about that, and think about all the resources that are going to controlling that species. But at the same time, we purposely stock non-native species in all kinds of places. It costs us lots of money to do that. And so, as taxpayers, right? That's taxpayer dollars that are doing that. And so it's just kind of, to me, it's an interesting kind of conflict, that occurs when we think about that.
Right. Okay, and then very quickly, which of the three alternatives did Mount Rainier choose for its management plan?
Yeah, they picked alternative 2, which was that they were going to remove non-native fish from some systems. So they're going to remove from a set of lakes and some streams and rivers. And I think that was kind of, I think it was interesting because it really reflected what we saw in our survey. And our survey was kind of designed to help inform their process, which I probably forgot to mention, but it was, to kind of give them some insight about what people were really thinking about this issue. And I was really grateful that we had a chance to kind of be able to give them some insight, and to be able to say, like, the public supports this option where we, actually set aside some systems and say, we're going to restore these. And then here's some other systems where you can go and angle and, recreate and do what you want to do. And so I think that's kind of an interesting outcome. And I think a good kind of take home about, balancing and managing the multiple uses that people kind of want from their public lands.
Yes. Okay, well, great. Thank you very much. Fascinating. I want to put out a plug for next week. Mary Tootie Baker will be talking on Aloha Aina, rebuilding our fractured relationship to place. And I also want to, again, just say thank you to Angela for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Good day.